Imagine a place where silence hides dark secrets. In the morgue of a major hospital in Mexico City, 3 forensic doctors believed they were above punishment. For years, they did what they wanted, certain that no one was watching them. But they were wrong. A forgotten camera recorded everything. When the images were leaked, revolt took over the country and the hunt began. But the law wasn't the only one looking for them. The question was not whether they would be punished, but as. Sit back, put on your headphones and get ready to dive into this story. Mexico City was buzzing with its chaotic routine. Ambulances crossed the streets at high speed, sirens echoed through tight alleys, and the General Hospital of La Raza was always crowded. As doctors and nurses rushed to save lives, there was one section of the hospital where time seemed to move differently. Behind cold metal doors, isolated from the emergency rush, was the morgue. A dark environment, where silence was absolute and where few dared to enter unnecessarily. The characteristic smell of formaldehyde and decomposing flesh permeated the walls, and the dim lighting made the place even more claustrophobic. It was in this environment that Alejandro Suarez, Ricardo Montalvo and Martin Herrera worked, 3 forensic doctors known for their efficiency and discretion. They each had their own reasons for being there. Alejandro, the oldest, had been in the morgue for over 20 years. Cold and calculating, he never showed emotions. Ricardo, on the other hand, was ambitious and restless. He was not content with just analyzing bodies, he liked the idea of having power over them. Martin, the youngest, at first felt uncomfortable with the atmosphere of the place, but soon got used to it. They were a team. Working together for so long, they developed a kind of silent code. In the morgue, they knew they were away from supervisors, away from questions, away from any kind of consequences. At first, they were just minor infractions. They manipulated autopsy records to cover up medical errors committed by hospital surgeons. In return, they received favors, money or simply guaranteed that they would be protected if they needed anything in the future. Over time, they began to disrespect bodies. At first, almost jokingly, as they said among themselves. They made jokes, mocked the corpses, took photos, and tested medical instruments inappropriately. Then it stopped being just morbid humor and became something darker. They began to single out certain bodies for special attention. Always women. Young people. Bodies that seemed more intact. They knew they were crossing a dangerous line, but inside the morgue there was no one to stop them. Impunity made them feel like they could do anything without suffering consequences. Night was the safest time. During the early hours of the morning, there was no one who dared to enter there. The few nurses who needed to register deaths avoided looking directly at the metal doors of the morgue, as if they felt there was something wrong in that place. That's why doctors became bolder. They began deleting certain images from old cameras, believing they had complete control over who could see them. But what they didn't know was that the hospital had updated its security system. For years, the morgue's cameras only covered the entrance. If anyone wanted to know what was going on inside, they would need to trust the medical reports. But a few months earlier, following an internal investigation into the disappearance of a body, the administration decided to step up surveillance. Without informing anyone, they installed cameras inside the morgue, discreetly positioned in the corners of the room. The doctors continued with their macabre routines without realizing that they were being observed. On any given night, Jorge Ramirez, the technician responsible for the hospital's security, did a random check of the recordings. It was a routine procedure. He glanced at the monitors, checking for anything suspicious. When he accessed the morgue images, he only expected to see doctors working. But what he saw was something completely different. The first thing that caught his attention was the way the doctors locked the door immediately after entering. Normally, that shouldn't be necessary. They covered the glass windows with lab coats or towels, something I had never seen before. He fast-forwarded a few hours into the recording and noticed that certain bodies were treated strangely. The doctors seemed to spend too much time beside them, as if they were doing something beyond normal protocol. Jorge felt a shiver run down his spine. He decided to investigate further. He went back to previous recordings, watched other night shifts. With each new video, his expression became more tense. He realized there was a pattern. They chose certain bodies. Always women. Always with the same characteristics. His stomach dropped. He knew he needed to report this, but who would believe him without proof? I needed to gather more evidence before taking the case to management. He started copying the recordings to a flash drive. His hands were shaking. He knew he was about to expose something terrible. Meanwhile, in the morgue, Alejandro, Ricardo and Martín went about their routine, believing they were safe. They had no idea that their nights of impunity were about to end. Jorge Ramirez felt a weight in his chest as he watched the images. He was not an easily impressed man. He had already worked for years in hospital security and knew that that place had its secrets. But nothing compared to what was before his eyes now. The clock said 3 in the morning, and the morgue, as always, was empty except for the 3 doctors. The camera recorded every movement. Alejandro locked the door as soon as he entered, while Ricardo covered the glass window. Martín seemed uneasy, but soon joined the others. The 3 were around a steel table, where the body of a young woman lay motionless. The way they spoke to each other, the muffled laughter and the gestures, something there was very wrong. Jorge felt a chill run up his spine. He paused the recording and took a deep breath. His instinct told him this was too big to just ignore. He copied the most compromising files to a flash drive and turned off the monitors. He needed to act cautiously. If you confronted someone too soon, you might be silenced before the truth came out. He left the security room and went directly to the office of the hospital director, Ernesto Vasquez, a man who valued the institution's reputation above all else. When Jorge knocked on the door, he already knew he would wake up a man who didn't like being disturbed. But that couldn't wait. "This has to be seen now," said Jorge, handing over the flash drive. Ernesto snorted, took the device and connected it to the computer without much interest. But as the minutes passed and the images unfolded on the screen, his expression changed. He leaned forward, eyes wide, breathing heavy. "For God's sake," he murmured. The director paused the video and rubbed his hands over his face. His mind reeled with the consequences of this. If those images were leaked, the hospital would be destroyed. The public would not forgive a scandal of this level. But Ernesto was not a man who made decisions on impulse. He needed time to evaluate his next steps. "You didn't tell anyone about this?" he asked. "Not yet. But I know that if anyone discovers these recordings, it will blow up." The director was silent for a long time, then took a deep breath and made a decision. "Let's keep this between us for now. If this story comes out, it will be the end of the hospital. I will speak to the doctors myself and resolve this internally." Jorge knew that meant one thing: Ernesto wanted to cover up the case. But he wasn't the only one who knew about the existence of those images. The error happened the next morning. While Jorge was still trying to decide what to do, a young IT employee, in charge of maintaining the servers, accessed the videos automatically stored in the hospital's cloud. He shouldn't have been messing around there, but, out of curiosity, he opened one of the files and started watching. It was enough. The scene that unfolded was so disturbing that the boy ran out of the room and showed the video to a friend. In a matter of minutes, a small group of people inside the hospital already knew what was happening in the morgue. And as it turned out, someone leaked the files to a journalist. The digital newspaper headline The Universal the next morning was devastating. "Forensic doctors are caught in disturbing acts in the morgue of the General Hospital of La Raza." The scandal exploded like a bomb in Mexico City. Within hours, social media was flooded with theories, indignant comments and calls for justice. Videos began to circulate in private groups, and pressure on the hospital increased unsustainably. Journalists surrounded the hospital entrance, demanding answers. Relatives of patients revolted, some even tried to invade the building. Employees who had worked there for years wondered why they had never noticed anything. But while the public demanded explanations, the three doctors were panicking. Alejandro, Ricardo and Martín were called to an urgent meeting. The hospital director received them with a pale face, sweat running down his forehead. "What did you do?" Ernesto roared, slamming his hand on the table. "Do you have any idea what you caused?" Alejandro tried to maintain his posture. "Director, this is all just a misunderstanding. The videos were taken out of context." But Ricardo had already lost confidence. He knew Mexico's judicial system well. "I knew that if they were arrested, they wouldn't last long in jail." Martín, the youngest and most emotionally fragile, began to sweat. "What will happen to us?" he asked in a low voice. The director did not respond. He knew there was no way around this situation. The truth was already out of control. The police were already involved. Arrest orders were issued for all three. That's when Alejandro realized that the only way out was to escape. But escaping was not that simple. They were not common criminals. They had no contacts in the underworld. They didn't know how to disappear. But they needed to try. Time was running out, and every minute that passed brought them closer to a fate far worse than any formal punishment. The problem was that the news had reached places none of them wanted it to have reached. And prison was perhaps not the worst fate that awaited them. Mexico City woke up in a frenzy. The case of the forensic doctors had become one of the biggest scandals in the country. Printed newspapers featured their photos in the main headlines, while TV channels repeated excerpts of the reports over and over again. On the internet, the public called for immediate punishment, and on the streets, protesters began to gather in front of the hospital demanding justice. The police had finally issued an arrest warrant for Alejandro, Ricardo and Martín, but when officers arrived at the hospital to detain them, the three were already gone. The hospital director, Ernesto Vasquez, stated that he did not know his whereabouts, but no one believed him. That morning, the three doctors were hiding in a rundown hotel in the Iztapalapa neighborhood. The room stank of mold, the ceiling fan turned slowly, and the curtains were drawn to avoid prying eyes. Ricardo was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding his head in his hands. Alejandro, the oldest and coldest, looked at his wristwatch, calculating his next steps. Martín, the youngest and most inexperienced, was shaking. "This can't be happening. This can't be happening," he repeated, almost voicelessly. Alejandro sighed and crossed his arms. "Do you think that if we hand ourselves over to the police, they will just put us in a cell and let us serve our time in peace? Do you think we will get a fair trial?" Martín did not respond. He knew the truth. Mexico's prisons did not forgive certain types of crimes. And at that moment, it wasn't just the authorities who were after them. "We need to leave the city now," Ricardo said, trying to sound firm. "We can't stay here waiting for the police or anyone else to find us." "Where are we going?" asked Martín. Alejandro already had a plan. "We're going to Tapachula and from there we cross into Guatemala. Then, we try to fly to a country that does not have an extradition agreement with Mexico." But escaping would not be so simple. While the three doctors discussed how they would escape, shocking news circulated within the prison system. Video from the morgue security cameras had reached the prisons. In the cramped and stuffy corridors of the Orient prison, one of the largest in Mexico City, inmates watched prohibited material on contraband cell phones. And the reaction was immediate. "These bastards have to pay," said one of the prisoners, in charge of passing information to the outside. The leader of the pavilion, a man known as El Rata, a former drug dealer with contacts both inside and outside prison, made a call. "Are the three still at large?" "Yes, but not for long," replied the voice on the other end of the line. The criminal underworld operated fast, much faster than the police. Alejandro, Ricardo and Martín were still thinking about their next steps when, unbeknownst to them, they were already being hunted. At 7 o'clock at night, the doctors left the hotel and went to the bus station. The plan was to board a bus to Tapachula, a long trip but one that would leave them close to the border with Guatemala. At the bus station, they blended into the crowd, trying to look like just ordinary travelers. Alejandro wore a cap, Ricardo had shaved his beard, and Martín kept the hood over his head. But it wasn't enough. When they were about to board, they felt something was wrong. Four hooded men appeared at the entrance to the bus station, walking slowly among the people. Ricardo was the first to notice and murmured, without looking directly. "We have a problem." The four men approached. "Stay calm, doctors. We just want to talk." Alejandro and Ricardo knew what that meant. Martín tried to run, but one of the men pulled out a gun and pointed it directly at his head. "Don't move." Silence took over the terminal. Some people realized what was happening, but no one dared to intervene. In Mexico, when armed men took control of a situation, the best option was to pretend they didn't see anything. The three doctors were taken to a black car with no license plates. They were not taken to the police station, nor for a discreet hiding place. They were taken to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The journey lasted about 30 minutes, and inside the car, no one said a word. When they arrived at the scene, they were dragged into the warehouse and thrown on the floor. The iron door closed behind them. In the darkness of the warehouse, there were more men waiting. One of them, sitting on a chair in the center of the space, watched the three doctors with a blank look. "Do you know why they are here?" he asked. Alejandro tried to respond, but was kicked in the stomach before he could open his mouth. "Did you think you could do what you did and just disappear?" continued the man. "Did you think the prisons would accept them and let them live?" The three doctors were terrified. Martín started to cry. "Please, we didn't do anything. They didn't do anything." The man laughed, but his laugh was cold. He pulled out a cell phone and pressed a button. The video from the morgue started playing. The doctors themselves had to watch the images of their crimes. This time, without the certainty that they were going unpunished. "We gave you a better trial than any court would," the man said. Alejandro, Ricardo and Martín did not leave that warehouse alive. 3 days later, police found 3 bodies in a vacant lot on the outskirts of Mexico City. The condition of the corpses was unrecognizable. There was no way to officially identify who they were, but there was no doubt. The 3 doctors had been found. The news was briefly reported in the media, but without major repercussions. No investigation was opened. No questions were asked. No explanation was given. The case of the missing forensic doctors has been officially closed without a solution. But everyone knew exactly what happened to them. Justice came, but not at the hands of the law.